A simple black barrel. Crude oil sealed inside, shipped across rail lines, stamped with a name that would become synonymous with power, Standard Oil. For decades, this barrel represented modern progress. Light in the darkness. Fuel for industry. The foundation of a new American century. Everyone knows the name Rockefeller. Everyone knows he became the richest man in history. But almost no one understands what his empire actually did to the world around it. Or what happened when that empire was finally broken apart. A company rises. A system bends. A fortune concentrates beyond comprehension. A government intervenes. A monopoly collapses. And somehow, the man at the center becomes even more powerful. Because the end of Standard Oil did not erase control. It redistributed it. It multiplied it. And it made it harder to see. This is not a story about how John D. Rockefeller built the greatest monopoly in history. This is a story about how losing control became his greatest form of power. The discipline of control. John Davison Rockefeller was not born into power. He was born into uncertainty. In 1839, in a modest home in Richford, New York, Rockefeller entered a world defined not by stability, but by contradiction. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman, though salesman was often a generous description. He moved from town to town, selling questionable remedies, operating under aliases, and living a life that blurred the line between charisma and deception. To some, he was a charming opportunist. To others, a con man. To his son, he was something far more complicated. William Rockefeller taught lessons, but never through consistency. He would disappear for weeks, sometimes months, only to return with stories, money, and a presence that filled the room. When he was there, he commanded attention. When he was gone, he left behind instability. It was a childhood defined by unpredictability. And in that environment, John Rockefeller made a quiet decision, one that would shape everything that followed. He would build a life that could not be shaken. Where his father embraced chaos, Rockefeller pursued order. Where his father relied on persuasion, Rockefeller relied on calculation. Where his father moved constantly, Rockefeller began to root himself in systems. This contrast became the foundation of his psychology. But the influence of his mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, may have been even more significant. She was deeply religious, disciplined, and frugal to an extreme. Every expense was accounted for. Every action weighed against moral consequence. She taught her children that waste was a form of failure, and that restraint was a virtue. In their household, money was never just currency. It was control. Young Rockefeller absorbed this fully. By the age of 16, he was already documenting every cent he earned and spent. He recorded loans to neighbors. He calculated interest. He tracked repayments with precision. While other boys saw money as something to spend, Rockefeller saw it as something to organize. And organization, to him, meant power. But the world he was entering was not organized. Mid-19th century America was volatile. Expansion was rapid. Markets were fragmented. Infrastructure was incomplete. Information moved slowly. Industries rose and collapsed with little warning. It was an economy filled with opportunity, but also risk. For most, this instability was something to navigate. For Rockefeller, it was something to eliminate. His first job came in Cleveland, Ohio, as a bookkeeper's assistant. The work was not glamorous, but it offered something far more valuable: visibility into how businesses functioned. He learned how goods were priced, how contracts were negotiated, how margins were protected or lost. But more importantly, he saw inefficiency everywhere. Transactions were inconsistent. Supply chains were unreliable. Competition was chaotic rather than strategic. Where others saw complexity, Rockefeller saw a pattern emerging. Not a system, but the absence of one. And in that absence, he saw possibility. At the time, oil was not yet the dominant force it would become. It was one of many emerging industries, driven largely by demand for kerosene, used for lighting homes and streets. The discovery of oil in Pennsylvania in the late 1850s triggered a rush. New companies formed overnight. Refineries appeared across regions. Prices fluctuated wildly. It was, in many ways, a frontier. And like all frontiers, it attracted speculation more than discipline. Rockefeller did not rush in immediately. He observed. He studied how oil moved from well to refinery, from refinery to market. He examined the volatility of pricing. He noticed how overproduction led to collapses, how lack of coordination created waste, how competitors undercut each other to the point of mutual damage. To many, this volatility was simply the nature of a new industry. To Rockefeller, it was a flaw waiting to be corrected. He did not see oil as a product. He saw it as a system that had not yet been controlled. And control, in his mind, was not just about dominance, it was about stability. In 1863, Rockefeller entered the oil business through a partnership, investing in a refinery in Cleveland. It was a calculated move, not a speculative one. He was not chasing opportunity. He was positioning himself within a structure he believed he could eventually shape. From the beginning, his approach was different. He focused on efficiency. He negotiated aggressively with suppliers. He minimized waste in refining processes. He reinvested profits rather than extracting them. While others expanded quickly, Rockefeller refined deeply. But this discipline came with a deeper implication. He was not just building a business. He was learning how to control an entire industry. Even at this early stage, there were signs, subtle but significant, that his ambitions extended beyond competition. He did not aim to be the best among many. He aimed to remove the many entirely. And yet, at this point, that intention remained invisible. To the outside world, Rockefeller was simply a disciplined young businessman. Reliable, reserved, methodical. But beneath that surface, a framework was forming. A belief that disorder was not natural, it was inefficient. That competition was not necessary, it was wasteful. That markets did not need to be free, they needed to be organized. These were not the ideas of a typical entrepreneur. They were the early foundations of something far more expansive and far more dangerous. Because if chaos created opportunity, then eliminating chaos would create control. And Rockefeller was already moving in that direction, quietly, deliberately, and without resistance. For now, the architecture of a monopoly. By the late 1860s, the oil industry was no longer a frontier. It was a battlefield. Hundreds of small refiners competed across the United States, each trying to secure crude supply, refine it efficiently, and ship it to market before prices shifted again. The result was predictable. Overproduction, price collapses, unstable profits. The industry was growing, but it was not stabilizing. For most entrepreneurs, this chaos was something to survive. For John D. Rockefeller, it was something to redesign. He had already proven that efficiency could create advantage. His refinery in Cleveland consistently outperformed competitors in cost control, yield, and reliability. But efficiency alone was not enough. Because no matter how well he operated, the market around him remained unpredictable. And unpredictability meant vulnerability. So Rockefeller began to think differently. Not about how to compete within the system, but how to reshape the system itself. In 1870, he formalized this vision by creating Standard Oil. On paper, it was just another company. In reality, it was the beginning of a structure designed to eliminate uncertainty. From the outset, Rockefeller focused on one principle: control every variable that could introduce risk. He negotiated aggressively with railroads, securing lower shipping rates than his competitors. But these were not ordinary discounts. They were secret agreements, rebates that reduced his costs, and even more controversially, drawbacks, where railroads would pay him based on shipments made by competing refiners. It was a system that turned competitors' activity into his own advantage. At first, these deals remained hidden, but their impact was immediate. Standard Oil could ship more cheaply, sell at lower prices, absorb market fluctuations. Competitors could not. And when they struggled, Rockefeller did not attack them publicly. He approached them privately. His strategy was not confrontation, it was acquisition. He would offer struggling refiners a choice: sell to Standard Oil, often in exchange for shares in the company, or continue competing in an environment that was becoming increasingly hostile. It was not framed as a threat. It was presented as inevitability. Many accepted. Those who resisted found themselves facing a system that no longer behaved like a free market. Prices would drop suddenly in their regions. Supply chains would tighten. Transportation costs would rise. These were not random events. They were controlled pressures. Rockefeller understood something his competitors did not. Control did not require visibility. It required coordination. Between 1870 and 1872, this strategy accelerated into what would later be known as the Cleveland Massacre. Within months, Rockefeller absorbed or eliminated the majority of Cleveland's refineries. What appeared to be organic consolidation was, in reality, a coordinated transformation. One by one, independent players disappeared. And with each acquisition, Standard Oil gained more than assets. It gained information, production levels, distribution networks, cost structures, data that allowed Rockefeller to refine his system further. Because now, he was not just operating within the market. He was beginning to understand it in its entirety. And once you understand a system completely, you can begin to predict it. And once you can predict it, you can control it. But Rockefeller's breakthrough was not just operational. It was structural. He recognized a fundamental limitation in traditional corporate models. Individual companies, even large ones, were still constrained by legal boundaries and fragmented ownership. They could grow, but they could not fully integrate. So he created something new. In 1882, Standard Oil was reorganized into a trust, a legal innovation that allowed multiple companies to be controlled under a single centralized board of trustees. It was not technically a monopoly, but functionally, it behaved like one. Separate entities. Unified control. This structure allowed Rockefeller to coordinate decisions across an entire industry without appearing to own it outright. It was, in many ways, invisible. And that invisibility was critical. Because by the early 1880s, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of the United States refining capacity. 90%. An industry that had once been fragmented was now centralized under a single system. Prices stabilized. Efficiency increased. Waste decreased. From one perspective, Rockefeller had achieved exactly what he set out to do. He had eliminated chaos. But in doing so, he had also eliminated competition. And with competition gone, the balance of power shifted. Completely. Standard Oil did not just influence the market. It defined it. Railroads depended on its shipments. Suppliers depended on its contracts. Markets depended on its pricing. It became not just a company, but an infrastructure. And Rockefeller, quietly, became the architect of that infrastructure. Yet even at the height of this breakthrough, there were signs, subtle but persistent, that this system could not remain uncontested. Journalists began to investigate. Competitors who had been forced out began to speak. Politicians started to question the concentration of power. At first, these voices were scattered, but they shared a common concern. What happens when one entity controls too much? Rockefeller did not respond publicly. He continued refining the system, expanding its reach, strengthening its coordination. Because from his perspective, the logic was clear. If fragmentation created instability, then consolidation created order. And order, in his view, justified the methods used to achieve it. But that assumption, quiet, rational, and deeply embedded, would eventually become the very thing that threatened everything he had built. Because systems that eliminate competition do not just remove chaos. They attract attention. And attention, in time, becomes pressure. For now, Standard Oil remained untouchable. But the conditions for its challenge had already begun to form. Unseen, unorganized, but inevitable. The system becomes the market. By the early 1880s, Standard Oil was no longer growing. It was absorbing. Expansion, in the traditional sense, new markets, new competitors, new risks, had already been replaced by something more controlled. Rockefeller was no longer entering industries. He was reorganizing them. The American oil business, once chaotic and decentralized, had been reduced to a network of dependencies. Refineries, pipelines, railroads, storage facilities, each component increasingly aligned under a single logic. Standard Oil's logic. But expansion did not stop at ownership. It moved into structure. Rockefeller understood that control over refining was only one layer of the system. True stability required influence over everything surrounding it: transportation, distribution, pricing, even information. So Standard Oil began extending itself vertically. Pipelines replaced railroads where possible, reducing reliance on external carriers. Storage facilities were strategically placed to regulate supply. Distribution networks were optimized to ensure that Standard Oil products reached markets faster and more reliably than any competitor could match. Each improvement appeared incremental, but together, they formed something far more significant. An integrated system where every part reinforced the others. And within that system, competitors faced a new reality. Even if they could refine oil, they could not move it efficiently. Even if they could move it, they could not store it at scale. Even if they could store it, they could not match Standard Oil's pricing without losing money. Competition still existed in theory. In practice, it had been neutralized. But Rockefeller's expansion was not purely mechanical. It was psychological. He cultivated a reputation, not through public statements, but through outcomes. Competitors learned quickly that resistance was costly. Markets learned that alignment with Standard Oil brought stability. This created a subtle shift. Businesses stopped thinking in terms of competing against Standard Oil. They began thinking in terms of negotiating with it. And negotiation, in Rockefeller's system, was rarely equal. Behind closed doors, agreements were made that reinforced his position without attracting attention. Pricing strategies were coordinated. Supply flows were adjusted. Markets were segmented. It was not visible enough to provoke immediate backlash, but it was precise enough to eliminate uncertainty. Standard Oil was no longer reacting to the market. It was anticipating it. And anticipation, when consistent, begins to resemble control. By the mid-1880s, this control extended beyond the United States. International markets, Europe, Asia, Latin America, became new territories for expansion. Standard Oil's logistical efficiency allowed it to export kerosene at prices competitors could not match. Foreign producers struggled to compete. Local markets adapted to Standard Oil's presence. Governments began to notice, but often too late. Because by the time resistance formed, the infrastructure was already in place. This global expansion introduced a new dimension to Rockefeller's empire. It was no longer just a domestic monopoly. It was an international system. And with that scale came a different kind of influence. Standard Oil's decisions affected not just industries, but economies. A change in pricing could disrupt local markets. A shift in supply could influence trade balances. A strategic partnership could reshape entire regions. Yet Rockefeller himself remained largely invisible. He did not seek public attention. He avoided political office. He rarely gave interviews. He operated through structures rather than personalities. This distance created a paradox. The most powerful figure in the most dominant industry of the era was also one of its least visible. And that invisibility served a purpose. Because power, when centralized but unseen, is harder to challenge. But not impossible. As Standard Oil expanded, so did the complexity of its operations. More subsidiaries. More agreements. More coordination. The system that Rockefeller had built to eliminate chaos was becoming increasingly intricate. And complexity introduces its own risks. Information had to flow accurately. Decisions had to align across multiple layers. Trust had to be maintained among partners and executives. Any fracture, internal or external, could disrupt the balance. For now, Rockefeller managed this complexity with discipline. He delegated carefully. He monitored performance closely. He enforced consistency across the organization. But the scale of the system was approaching a threshold. One where control required not just structure, but constant reinforcement. And reinforcement, over time, creates visibility. Journalists began to map the network. Regulators started to question the trust structure. Public sentiment shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, these were isolated signals. But they pointed to a growing realization. Standard Oil was no longer just efficient. It was dominant. And dominance, unlike efficiency, invites scrutiny. Rockefeller had built a system designed to eliminate instability. But in doing so, he had also concentrated power to a degree that could not remain unnoticed indefinitely. The very mechanisms that enabled his expansion, integration, coordination, invisibility, were beginning to draw attention. Not because they were failing, but because they were working too well. And when a system works too well, it begins to raise a different kind of question. Not how it operates, but whether it should exist at all. That question had not yet been fully asked, but it was forming. quietly, across institutions that Rockefeller did not control. And once asked, it would be difficult to ignore, because expansion, at this scale, does not just create power. It reveals it. And revealed power is no longer invisible. It becomes a target. The illusion of stability. By the 1890s, Standard Oil was no longer an empire in the making. It was an empire complete. Its dominance was not speculative. It was measurable. At its peak, Standard Oil controlled close to 90% of oil refining in the United States. Its influence extended across transportation, distribution, and international markets. Competitors existed, but only within the boundaries that Standard Oil allowed. The system Rockefeller had envisioned decades earlier was now fully realized. And within that system, stability had been achieved. Prices no longer fluctuated violently. Supply chains operated with precision. Markets responded predictably. To the outside world, this looked like progress. To Rockefeller, it looked like validation. He had done what others could not. He had taken chaos and replaced it with order. But beneath this stability, something else had formed. Dependence. Railroads relied on Standard Oil's volume to remain profitable. Banks depended on its financial activity. Entire regions were economically tied to its operations. Standard Oil was no longer just participating in the economy. It was anchoring it. And when a single entity becomes an anchor, its presence begins to shape everything around it. Industries adapted to its pricing structures. Governments adjusted to its influence. Public perception began to shift, not immediately, but gradually. Because power at this scale does not announce itself. It accumulates, quietly, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Rockefeller himself had stepped back from day-to-day operations by this point, formally retiring in 1897. But retirement, in his case, did not mean disengagement. The system he had built did not require his constant presence. It required his design. And that design continued to function. Through trusted executives. Through established processes. Through a culture that prioritized efficiency above all else. From a distance, Rockefeller could observe his creation operating exactly as intended. And for a time, it appeared unshakable. But power, when concentrated, begins to produce unintended consequences. The very stability that Standard Oil created also eliminated alternatives. Independent refiners had largely disappeared. New entrants found it nearly impossible to compete. Innovation slowed, not because it was unnecessary, but because it had no space to emerge. The system had become optimized. But optimization, taken too far, becomes rigidity. And rigidity, in a changing environment, becomes vulnerability. At the same time, a different kind of pressure was building. Public awareness. Journalists, once scattered in their critiques, began to organize their investigations. Among them was Ida Tarbell, whose detailed expose on Standard Oil would become one of the most influential pieces of investigative journalism in American history. She did not attack Rockefeller with rhetoric. She dissected the system, revealing the secret rebates, the coordinated acquisitions, the mechanisms of control that had remained largely hidden. For the first time, the public began to see Standard Oil not as a symbol of efficiency, but as a structure of dominance. And perception, once shifted, is difficult to reverse. Politicians took notice. The Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in 1890, had initially been a vague and underutilized piece of legislation. But as public pressure increased, it became a tool, one that could be directed at monopolistic structures. At first, enforcement was inconsistent. Cases were brought. Some failed. Others stalled. But the idea had been introduced, that even the most powerful private entities could be challenged. Rockefeller did not respond publicly to these developments. He remained consistent in his approach. Order was still preferable to chaos. Efficiency still justified consolidation. The system still functioned. From his perspective, the criticism misunderstood the outcome. Standard Oil had lowered prices for consumers. It had improved quality. It had created reliability in an industry that once lacked it. These were measurable benefits. But the criticism was not about outcomes alone. It was about control. Who held it? How it was exercised? And what it meant for a society that increasingly valued competition as a principle. This tension, between efficiency and fairness, between stability and freedom, began to define the environment in which Standard Oil operated. And it introduced a new variable. Not economic, but political. Unlike markets, political systems do not respond purely to efficiency. They respond to pressure. And pressure, once it reaches a certain threshold, forces action. By the early 1900s, that threshold was approaching. The federal government, under President Theodore Roosevelt, began to take a more aggressive stance against monopolies. Standard Oil was no longer just a successful company. It was a test case, a symbol of what unchecked corporate power could become. And symbols attract attention in ways systems do not. For Rockefeller, this represented a shift he could not fully control. His system had been designed to manage markets, not governments, not public sentiment, not legal interpretation. These were external forces, less predictable, less structured, and increasingly focused on his creation. The empire remained intact. Its operations continued. Its profits grew. But the environment around it was changing. And for the first time, the stability Rockefeller had built began to feel conditional, dependent not just on internal efficiency, but on external acceptance. That acceptance was beginning to erode. Slowly, quietly, but definitively. Because power, once visible, invites response. And the more complete that power appears, the stronger that response becomes. The logic that could not adapt. The system Rockefeller built was designed to eliminate uncertainty. For decades, it succeeded. Standard Oil reduced volatility, stabilized prices, and transformed a fragmented industry into a coordinated machine. Every inefficiency was identified. Every variable was managed. Every competitor was either absorbed or neutralized. From within the system, it appeared flawless. But the flaw was never in the execution. It was in the assumption behind it. Rockefeller believed that markets, left alone, produced chaos, and that chaos justified control. It was a rational belief, supported by results. But it contained a limitation he could not see. Because systems built to eliminate competition do not just remove instability. They remove resistance. And without resistance, there is nothing to signal when a system has gone too far. Inside Standard Oil, decisions were increasingly optimized for efficiency. Costs were minimized. Processes were standardized. Outcomes were predictable. But predictability created a subtle distortion. The company began to interpret its success as proof that its structure was correct, not just effective, but justified. And once a system begins to justify itself, it stops questioning its own boundaries. Rockefeller had always avoided public confrontation. He did not engage critics directly. He did not defend his methods in political arenas. He trusted that results would speak for themselves. For a time, they did. But the environment had changed. Public perception was no longer shaped solely by outcomes. It was shaped by narrative. And Standard Oil's narrative was no longer under Rockefeller's control. Ida Tarbell's investigation did not introduce new facts to insiders, but it introduced those facts to the public, organized, detailed, and impossible to ignore. The rebates, the pressure tactics, the consolidation strategies. Individually, each action could be explained. Together, they formed a pattern. And that pattern told a different story. Not of efficiency, but of dominance. Rockefeller's system had been built to operate quietly. But now it was being examined loudly. And examination changes how power is perceived. What had once been seen as discipline began to look like manipulation. What had once been viewed as coordination began to resemble control. The difference was not in the actions themselves. It was in who was observing them. Rockefeller did not adjust. He remained consistent. The system continued to function. Profits continued to grow. Operations remained stable. From a structural perspective, nothing was broken. But outside the system, pressure was building. Legal frameworks, once vague, were becoming more defined. The Sherman Antitrust Act was no longer theoretical. It was being interpreted, tested, and applied. Courts began to consider a new question. Not whether Standard Oil was efficient, but whether its existence limited the freedom of others to compete. This was not a question Rockefeller had designed his system to answer. Because in his framework, competition was the problem, not the solution. And that difference in perspective created a gap. between how Standard Oil understood itself and how it was understood by the institutions now evaluating it. That gap widened over time. Executives within Standard Oil continued to operate under the assumption that efficiency justified scale, that integration justified control, that outcomes justified methods. But the legal system did not operate on those assumptions. It operated on principles: fairness, competition, balance of power. These were not variables Rockefeller could optimize. They were constraints he could not eliminate. And as these constraints became more active, the flaw in his system became more visible. Not internally, but externally. Standard Oil had become too effective, too centralized, too dominant, too essential. It had reached a point where its very success contradicted the values of the system it operated within. And systems, when confronted with contradictions of that scale, do not adapt quietly. They respond. Rockefeller had spent decades removing unpredictability from his business, but he had not removed it from the world around him. Governments could act unpredictably. Public opinion could shift rapidly. Legal interpretations could evolve. These were forces outside his control. And his system, for all its precision, had not been built to engage with them. It had been built to bypass them. For a time, that worked. But bypassing pressure does not eliminate it. It delays it. And delayed pressure, when it returns, does so with greater force. By the early 20th century, that force was beginning to concentrate. Investigations intensified. Legal cases advanced. Public scrutiny increased. Standard Oil remained intact, but its position was no longer unquestioned. And for the first time, the possibility emerged, not as speculation, but as a realistic outcome, that the system Rockefeller had built could be dismantled. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded too completely. That was the flaw. Not a mistake in execution, but a design that could not adapt to the consequences of its own success. And once those consequences began to materialize, they moved beyond Rockefeller's ability to manage them. Because control, when extended too far, begins to generate its own opposition. And that opposition, once organized, does not negotiate. It acts. The breakup that changed nothing. In 1906, the pressure became formal. The United States government filed a lawsuit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was not the first challenge Rockefeller's empire had faced, but it was the first that carried the full weight of the federal system. For years, criticism had circulated through journalism, politics, and public discourse. Now, it was being translated into legal action, structured, deliberate, and difficult to ignore. The case did not focus on a single action. It examined the entire system. The acquisitions, the pricing strategies, the agreements with railroads, the trust structure itself. Individually, each element could be defended. Together, they formed a pattern that the government argued was incompatible with a competitive market. Standard Oil responded with the same logic it had always used: efficiency, stability, lower prices for consumers. From within the system, these arguments were consistent. But the case was no longer about internal logic. It was about external interpretation. For nearly 5 years, the legal process unfolded. Arguments were presented. Evidence was examined. Precedents were debated. The complexity of Standard Oil structure made the case difficult to navigate. Its network of subsidiaries, agreements, and layered ownership blurred the boundaries of control. But that complexity also reinforced the government's position. Because what could not be easily understood could not be easily regulated. And what could not be regulated posed a risk. In 1911, the decision arrived. The United States Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil had violated antitrust laws. The company would be broken apart. Not reformed. Not fined. Dismantled. It was a decisive moment. One of the most powerful corporations in history, an entity that had shaped an entire industry, was ordered to divide itself into separate companies. 34 independent entities would emerge from the breakup. On the surface, it appeared to be the end. The system Rockefeller had spent decades constructing was being undone. Control, once centralized, would be distributed. Competition, once suppressed, would return. The market would be restored. That was the expectation. But reality moved differently. Because while the structure of Standard Oil was dismantled, its ownership was not erased. Rockefeller, along with key shareholders, retained significant stakes in the newly formed companies: Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of California, and others. Each entity operated independently, but they shared a common origin, and more importantly, a common set of assets: infrastructure, knowledge, market position. The breakup did not create new competitors. It reorganized existing power. In the immediate aftermath, something unexpected happened. The value of these individual companies increased. Freed from the constraints of the trust structure, they adapted more flexibly to regional markets. They innovated independently. They competed, but from positions of strength that had already been established. And as their value grew, so did Rockefeller's wealth. The man whose empire had been dismantled became richer, not despite the breakup, but because of it. What appeared to be a collapse was, in effect, a transformation. Control had shifted from direct coordination to distributed ownership. Less visible, more complex, harder to regulate. The system had not disappeared. It had evolved. For the public, the ruling represented a victory, a demonstration that no corporation was beyond the reach of the law. For the government, it established a precedent. Monopolies could be challenged. Power could be limited. But beneath these outcomes, a different reality persisted. The economic influence that Standard Oil had created did not vanish. It fragmented. And fragmentation, when structured correctly, does not weaken power. It multiplies it. Because instead of one entity controlling the market, there were now many, each shaped by the same origin, each carrying forward elements of the same system. Rockefeller no longer needed to manage a single empire. He benefited from many. This was not the outcome anyone had anticipated. The collapse had occurred, but the consequences did not align with the intention. Standard Oil was gone, but its power remained, reconfigured, distributed, and more difficult to trace. The system that had been dismantled in structure had survived in substance. And in that transformation, Rockefeller achieved something unexpected. He lost control of the empire he built, but he did not lose the power it created. He changed its form, the inheritance of invisible power. By the time Standard Oil was dismantled in 1911, John D. Rockefeller was no longer building. He was preserving. The structure he had created had been broken apart, but the wealth it generated had not only survived, it had expanded. And with that expansion came a new challenge. Not how to control an industry, but how to control what came after it. Because wealth at that scale does not disappear. It transfers to institutions, to systems, to the next generation. Rockefeller understood this transition with the same clarity that had defined his rise. Direct control over markets had proven vulnerable. It attracted attention, regulation, and eventual intervention. But influence, when distributed carefully, could endure. And so the focus shifted. From industry to infrastructure. From ownership to governance. From visibility to permanence. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., inherited not just wealth, but responsibility for managing its consequences. He was different. Less aggressive. More publicly engaged. More aware of the scrutiny that followed the family name. Where Rockefeller Sr. had operated quietly within systems, Rockefeller Jr. began to engage with the public perception of those systems. This was not a rejection of power. It was a reconfiguration of it. Philanthropy became the primary instrument. Universities were funded. Foundations were established. Public institutions were shaped through strategic giving. The Rockefeller Foundation, the University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, these were not just charitable efforts. They were structures. Long-term, self-sustaining entities designed to influence fields that extended far beyond oil. Education, science, public health. Each initiative appeared independent, but together they formed a network. One that redirected wealth into areas that shaped society at a foundational level. This shift altered how power was perceived. Standard Oil had been visible, its dominance measurable, its actions traceable. The new system was different. It did not control a single industry. It influenced multiple domains simultaneously. And it did so without the appearance of control. Decisions were made through boards. Funding was distributed through institutions. Outcomes emerged over time, rather than through immediate market impact. This made the power less direct, but more enduring, because influence embedded in systems does not require constant intervention. It sustains itself. The next generation of Rockefellers expanded this approach. They entered finance. They engaged with international policy. They participated in the development of global institutions. The family name remained associated with wealth, but its expression evolved from industrial dominance to institutional presence. And with that evolution came a new kind of distance. The connection between the original source of wealth, oil, and its modern applications became less visible. What remained was the effect. Hospitals, universities, research centers, structures that carried the Rockefeller imprint without reflecting its origin. But this transition was not without tension. Managing distributed power introduces complexity. Different branches of the family pursued different priorities. Institutions developed their own agendas. Public expectations shifted. The coherence that had defined Standard Oil, its centralized decision-making, its unified strategy, was no longer present. In its place was a network. Flexible, but less controlled. This raised a different kind of question. Not whether the Rockefellers still held power, but whether that power could be directed with the same precision. Because influence, when spread across generations and institutions, becomes harder to align. It persists, but it changes. And in that change, something is lost. The clarity of intent, the consistency of action, the direct connection between decision and outcome. Rockefeller Sr. had built a system where control was absolute. His successors inherited a system where control was shared, not diminished, but diluted. And yet, the underlying structure remained. The wealth continued to grow. The institutions continued to operate. The influence continued to extend. Not through dominance, but through presence. This was the final transformation of the Rockefeller Empire. From a monopoly that controlled an industry, to a network that shaped multiple aspects of society. Less visible, more complex, and far more difficult to define. Because the question was no longer where the power existed, but how it moved. And who, if anyone, could fully control it. The system that outlived its creator. Long after Standard Oil ceased to exist, its structure remained. Not as a company, but as a template. The idea that an industry could be organized, consolidated, and controlled did not disappear with Rockefeller. It was studied, replicated, adapted, across sectors, banking, railroads, steel, technology. The names changed. The industries evolved. But the underlying logic persisted. Scale creates efficiency. Efficiency creates dominance. Dominance attracts regulation. Regulation reshapes the structure, but rarely eliminates the power. This cycle did not end with Standard Oil. It began there. The companies that emerged from its breakup continued to define the global energy market for decades. Some merged. Others rebranded. Many became the foundations of modern multinational corporations. Their origins traced back to a single system. One that had been dismantled, but never erased. At the same time, the legal response to Standard Oil established a framework that would shape future interventions. Antitrust laws became more active. Governments developed tools to address monopolistic behavior. Public expectations shifted toward the idea that markets should remain open. But enforcement, like power, evolved. Each new case introduced new complexities. Because as corporations adapted, so did their structures. Holding companies replaced trusts. Global operations replaced domestic concentration. Digital systems replaced physical infrastructure. Power became less centralized, but more interconnected. And in that interconnectedness, it became harder to isolate. The Rockefeller legacy exists within this dynamic, not as a single entity, but as an influence embedded in how systems are built. Corporate strategy, regulatory frameworks, institutional design. Each carries elements of the original model, sometimes directly, often indirectly. The family itself remains present, but not dominant in the way it once was. Its wealth, while still significant, is no longer singular in scale. Other fortunes have surpassed it. Other industries have emerged. But comparison misses the point. Because Rockefeller's significance was never just about how much he controlled. It was about how he controlled it, and how that method reshaped the relationship between private power and public systems. Today, the effects are visible in ways that are easy to overlook. Large corporations operate across multiple sectors, coordinating complex supply chains and influencing global markets. Governments regulate, but also depend on the stability those corporations provide. Institutions funded generations ago continue to shape research, education, and policy. These are not direct extensions of Standard Oil, but they exist within the framework it helped establish. A world where power is not always concentrated in a single entity, but distributed across systems that reinforce one another. This distribution creates a different kind of challenge. It is harder to identify, harder to measure, harder to confront, because there is no single structure to dismantle, no single decision to reverse. The legacy of Rockefeller is not a company. It is a way of organizing power, one that survives change, adapts to pressure, and continues to operate, often without being recognized as a continuation of its origin. The empire ended. The system did not. A black barrel. Once, it moved quietly across rail lines, unmarked except for a name that came to define an era. Inside it was oil, refined and controlled, part of a system that reshaped an entire industry. That system is gone. Standard Oil no longer exists. Its structure was dismantled. Its dominance divided. Its name absorbed into history. But the logic that filled those barrels did not disappear. It spread into companies that no longer carry the same name, into institutions that no longer trace their origin, into systems that operate without a single center. What was once visible, one company, one man, one structure, became something harder to see. A network, a pattern, a way of organizing power that does not require recognition to function. Rockefeller lost control of the empire he built. The courts ensured that. But the power it created did not collapse. It changed form. And in that transformation, it became less concentrated and more permanent. The barrel is gone. The system remains.